In 1853, deep in the rural backroads of Alabama, the Sullivan twins were born, children so disturbing that doctors swore they could not be explained by science. Hidden away inside a farmhouse with shuttered windows, their existence was erased from records, their lives reduced to whispers in family Bibles and late-night tales. This is the story of the Sullivan children, how a family concealed them, how doctors buried the truth, and how their legacy still haunts the records that remain. If you're drawn to stories like this, subscribe to the Macabre Record and let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? The story begins on the edges of a small farming community in Alabama, where isolation was not a choice, but a way of life. In 1853, families lived far apart, bound by the rhythm of harvests, bound by tradition, and bound by fear of what could not be understood. The Sullivan farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road, its windows boarded from the inside, its smoke curling into the sky long after neighbors had doused their lamps. It was a house people rarely visited, though its family carried a name that was otherwise respected. People spoke politely of the Sullivans in daylight, but at night the conversations changed. Neighbors told of faint cries drifting across the fields when the wind shifted. Some said they saw candlelight moving through the upper rooms long past midnight. Others swore they heard voices, not one, but two, murmuring in eerie unison. The Sullivans themselves remained silent. The patriarch, Thomas Sullivan, was a man of sturdy reputation in the church pews, his hat always in hand, his posture unbending. His wife, Eleanor, was rarely seen, appearing only in the company of her husband, her eyes fixed low to the ground. For a time, their secrecy might have gone unnoticed, dismissed as the private strangeness of one family. But then came the whispers of a birth. A difficult one, a strange one, a delivery shrouded in silence. No midwife would speak of it, though one was surely present. And after that night, the Sullivan home grew darker still. Children in the area learned to avoid the farmhouse, not because they were told to, but because instinct warned them. Some claimed to have seen small figures moving behind the covered windows. Others said they were chased away by Thomas himself, who grew harsher in tone each time someone wandered too close to his property. For a man who had once been known for his neighborly handshakes and quiet generosity, the change was unsettling. Something had altered in the Sullivan household, something powerful enough to turn pride into paranoia. And yet it was not until the arrival of a traveling physician that the rumors found substance. His journals, though scattered and incomplete, would later suggest that he had been invited, or perhaps forced, to see what the Sullivans were hiding. What he wrote was brief but terrifying, that the twins he observed were not merely unusual, but beyond the boundaries of medical knowledge. Children, yes, and yet something more. It was a traveller who first gave the whispers shape. In 1853, men passed through the South constantly, traders, surveyors, peddlers of medicines both real and false. Most left little behind but a footprint in the dust. Yet one man, remembered only as a physician from Georgia, stayed just long enough to leave a mark on the Sullivans' secret. He had been following the old road between Montgomery and Selma when he was directed toward the Sullivan farmhouse for supper and a bed. Hospitality was expected of rural families then, but what the man saw and heard that night was anything but ordinary. He would later write, in a scattered note that survived only in part, that the Sullivan home was uneasy. The curtains were drawn tight despite the humid heat, and the smell of smoke from too many lamps filled the rooms. Eleanor Sullivan, he noted, spoke hardly at all, and when she did, her words seemed rehearsed, as if she were trying not to reveal too much. Thomas, on the other hand, was cordial but tense, his eyes moving constantly toward the staircase that led to the upper rooms. At night, the physician claimed he heard something from above. Faint voices, hushed but not indistinct. He described them as two children speaking together, and though the words were muffled, the rhythm was identical, as though the voices moved in unison. He dismissed it at first as some trick of the ear, but the sound persisted, unsettling him so deeply that he confessed he did not sleep. When dawn came, he made an excuse to leave early, yet curiosity outweighed his fear, and before departing, he pressed Thomas Sullivan with a question. "Have you children?" The answer, the physician wrote, came after a pause too long to be honest. Thomas finally said only, "The Lord has blessed us in his way." No names, no ages, no mention of a birth. That short exchange was enough to plant the first seeds of suspicion. When the traveller moved on, he carried the story with him. In the next town, he mentioned it to an innkeeper. By the following week, a blacksmith in another county was repeating the tale of a family hiding twins they would not acknowledge. Rumours spread faster than wagons could travel, and soon the Sullivans were no longer simply a quiet family at the edge of town. They were the subject of an unease that grew larger with each retelling, and with every new voice, the story gained darker details that could not easily be dismissed. In 1853, Alabama was a place where silence carried further than sound. The state was still young, carved out of wilderness and cotton fields, its small towns separated by long stretches of dirt roads and pine woods. To live in the countryside was to live apart, and for families like the Sullivans, isolation was both a shield and a prison. Neighbours could be miles away, which meant that secrets could remain buried for years. Yet when whispers did begin, they had nowhere to hide, because in a land of scarcity, gossip was as sustaining as bread. Life in rural Alabama was harsh and unrelenting. The summers boiled with heat that pressed into the skin, and winters, though short, carried a damp cold that settled into bone. Families rose with the sun, working the land with little rest, their survival tethered to the harvest. Education was thin, medicine thinner, and superstition often took the place of science. A child born with an illness, a deformity, or even unusual behavior could be seen as a curse, a punishment, or a sign of divine displeasure. Communities leaned heavily on scripture to interpret what they could not explain, and when faith faltered, fear took over. The Sullivans lived on the edge of this world. Their farm produced enough to sustain them, but their seclusion was noted. While most families relied on community, trading goods, attending gatherings, sharing labor during planting and harvest, Thomas Sullivan grew more withdrawn after the rumored birth of his twins. He rarely visited town, and when he did, his manner was stiff, almost suspicious, as though each word he spoke had been measured. Eleanor was seen even less, slipping through church doors in silence, leaving quickly after the final hymn. For many families, such behavior might have gone unnoticed, but in an isolated community, differences stand out. Why did the Sullivans refuse to host gatherings anymore? Why were their windows shuttered, even in the sweltering heat? Why did they burn lamps through the night when oil was precious? Each unanswered question fed into the growing unease, and the land itself seemed to echo the strangeness. Travellers passing their farm at night reported hearing sounds that did not belong, voices rising faintly from the fields, sometimes laughter, sometimes cries, always indistinct. Others swore the farmhouse seemed unnaturally lit, as if the glow of its lamps bled out from beneath the shutters. For people already steeped in superstition, such details became proof. The Sullivans were not merely private. They were hiding something, and whatever it was, it lived in the upstairs rooms of that farmhouse. In mid-19th century Alabama, medicine was less a science than a fragile balancing act between scripture, folklore, and whatever knowledge a physician could piece together from outdated European texts. Most rural communities had no doctor at all, relying instead on midwives, herbalists, or neighbours with little more than handed-down remedies. Leeches, bleeding, and poultices of roots and bark were still common, and when these failed, people turned to prayer. In such a world, anything outside the ordinary was rarely treated with calm inquiry. It was branded as an omen, a curse, or divine punishment. Children born with clubfoot, a twisted spine, or even a birthmark too prominent were often hidden away by families desperate to avoid shame. In towns where every pair of eyes watched every other household, to admit you had a child who was different was to risk being seen as cursed. Neighbours might refuse to trade, church congregations might whisper about sin, and entire families could find themselves quietly shunned. It was easier, many believed, to keep such things secret, to close shutters, to explain absences with half-truths, to insist on privacy where none was usually afforded. Doctors themselves were no safeguard against these fears. Many physicians, especially those who travelled from town to town, depended on the goodwill of communities for their survival. To challenge local superstition was dangerous. It risked not only one's reputation, but one's livelihood. And so, when confronted with something inexplicable, doctors often complied with silence. Some even encouraged concealment, advising families to let the matter remain private rather than risk scandal. Others recorded their findings in private journals, knowing their words might never be published, fearing that colleagues would ridicule them or accuse them of fraud. This was the atmosphere in which the Sullivan twins were born. If they were unusual, malformed, conjoined, or afflicted with conditions that baffled understanding, then it is little wonder their parents chose secrecy over exposure. For Thomas Sullivan, a man already known for his proud posture and rigid faith, the birth of children who defied explanation could only be read as a test, or worse, as condemnation. Eleanor, bound by the expectations of silence and obedience, would have borne the burden in quiet desperation. And so superstition filled the void where science might have spoken. Each muffled sound from the Sullivan house became proof of sin. Each shuttered window was a sign of guilt. Medicine could have explained, or at least attempted to understand, but in Alabama in 1853, medicine was too fragile to withstand the weight of fear. It was easier to hide the truth, or to bury it. Before the whispers began, the Sullivan family carried a reputation that most in their community regarded with quiet respect. Thomas Sullivan was not wealthy by the standards of plantation owners, but he managed his land with diligence, producing steady harvests of cotton and corn. He was known to arrive at church every Sunday, dressed plainly but neatly, his Bible held tightly in his hand. He rarely missed a service, and when he did, the absence was noted. He did not drink, did not gamble, and rarely raised his voice. His character, at least in the eyes of neighbors, was that of a reliable man, stern but upright. Eleanor Sullivan, though more reserved, was remembered as a gentle figure. In earlier years, she had been seen tending the sick within her household, nursing neighbors' children when fever swept through the community, and offering food to travelers who knocked at their door. Her silence, which would later become a subject of suspicion, had once been interpreted as modesty. Together, Thomas and Eleanor seemed to embody the values prized in their corner of Alabama: faith, industry, and a devotion to family. But after the birth of the twins, something changed. Invitations to church suppers were declined. Their once open-door hospitality ceased. Those who approached the farmhouse were received coldly, if at all. Thomas began to shorten his visits into town, his errands carried out briskly, his conversations clipped. Eleanor all but disappeared from public view. If she did appear, it was fleeting and always at Thomas's side, her eyes cast downward as if in deliberate avoidance of recognition. It was not the secrecy alone that drew attention, but the contrast. A family once steady in its rhythms had suddenly turned inward. Neighbors, particularly in small communities, are quick to notice when patterns break, and the Sullivans' new behavior sparked questions that no one could answer. Some suspected illness, others whispered of debt or private shame. Yet as the weeks turned to months, these explanations grew less convincing. Why were no sounds of play ever heard from their home? Why did no children appear in the fields or at the church when families with newborns almost always presented their young with pride? The longer the Sullivans withdrew, the more their reputation transformed. Respect turned to wariness, admiration to doubt. For in a community where reputation was currency, secrecy was a debt no one could forgive. And the more the family concealed, the more certain their neighbors became that something inside that farmhouse was never meant to be seen. No one could agree on exactly how the Sullivan twins came into the world, but every version of the story carried the weight of unease. Some swore there had been no midwife at all, that Eleanor had labored in silence within the farmhouse while Thomas barred the doors, refusing any help. Others whispered that a midwife had been summoned from miles away but was never seen again in the community, as though she had been paid to vanish with her knowledge. The truth, if it ever was known, dissolved into rumor. What all accounts shared, however, was the sense that something about that birth, was not ordinary. Older women in the parish claimed they remembered hearing a wagon rattling up the Sullivan Road on a stormy night, the sound of hooves drowned by thunder. They insisted the wagon belonged to a travelling healer, not a neighbour. If this was true, then perhaps even before the twins' birth, the Sullivans knew they would need discretion. Yet others argued that no wagon had passed, that the birth took place alone, under cover of darkness, and that the very first cries of the children were smothered before they could reach the air outside the house. Whispered accounts varied, but one detail remained consistent. The twins were said to have been born alive, and their cries, though faint, carried a tone that unsettled those who heard it. One neighbour swore she had passed near the farmhouse at dawn and had heard not one infant, but two, crying together in a strange cadence, almost as though their voices were layered. She admitted she had quickened her pace and never spoken of it until years later, when the story had already taken root. The secrecy surrounding the birth became, in itself, evidence. Why had no baptism been held? In a community where infants were typically blessed and presented to the congregation within weeks, the silence of the Sullivan family was deafening. Even more curious was the absence of a burial record. If the children had died, as Thomas later suggested to one neighbour in a curt reply, where were their graves? The churchyard bore no markers, and the Sullivan property showed no sign of freshly turned earth. So the questions multiplied. Were the children deformed in some grotesque way? Were they sickly and frail, unfit to survive? Or were they something altogether different, something their parents could not allow the world to see? Whatever the truth, the night of their birth was the moment the Sullivan home became less a dwelling and more a place of mystery, its windows shuttered not only against the weather but against the gaze of the entire community. After the night of their birth, the twins seemed to vanish into silence, as though they had been swallowed whole by the walls of the Sullivan farmhouse. In a community where new life was often shared openly, their absence became its own haunting presence. Neighbours who expected to see Eleanor at church with infants in her arms instead saw her arrive alone, her face drawn, her hands clasped tightly as if clutching something invisible. When pressed about her children, she said little, sometimes nothing at all. The omission was more telling than any confession could have been. Thomas grew harsher in his dealings. Once known to linger in conversation after services, he now kept his replies short, his eyes fixed on the ground. He discouraged visitors, turning away those who approached with offers of help or curiosity. Even family friends found themselves unwelcome. In a time when hospitality was not just custom but necessity, the refusal struck many as unnatural. But if Thomas felt guilt, he did not show it. Instead, he carried on with the posture of a man guarding something too fragile or too terrible to be seen. Those who lived closest to the Sullivans began to notice other details. The curtains of the upstairs windows never shifted, even when the summer air grew unbearable. Lamps burned late into the night, their faint glow seeping through cracks in the shutters. On still evenings, sounds drifted across the fields, murmurs that might have been children, though the voices seemed strange in tone, uncanny in rhythm. A few swore they heard laughter, but it was laughter that unsettled rather than comforted, like echoes played back through a hollow chamber. The Sullivans themselves offered no explanations. To questions about children, Thomas replied that the Lord gives and takes as he sees fit, a statement so vague it settled nothing. Eleanor, pale and quiet, seemed to retreat further into herself, her appearance in town dwindling until even at church she seemed ghost-like, present in body but absent in spirit. The concealment had consequences. Suspicion hardened into certainty among the neighbours, who began to share their theories in hushed tones. Some said the twins had died and were hidden in unmarked graves. Others claimed the children lived still but bore deformities so shocking the parents refused to let them be seen. A few went further, suggesting that what the Sullivans concealed was not simply a medical condition, but a curse carried in flesh, a punishment visited upon the family for sins unspoken. The deeper the Sullivans sank into silence, the louder the rumours grew outside their walls. By the second year after the twins' birth, the farmhouse had become a landmark of unease in the countryside. Neighbors passing along the dirt road at night began to tell stories of strange lights glowing through the cracks of the shutters. Some described it as nothing more than lamplight, but others swore the glow was unnatural, a flickering that pulsed in ways no flame ever could. A few went further, insisting that coloured light, pale blue or even green, sometimes spilled faintly into the dark, staining the grass with its shimmer before vanishing. The sounds were worse. Children walking home from chores near dusk whispered that they heard voices drifting from the Sullivan property. Not the laughter of healthy play, not the cries of infants, but something else. Low murmurs, sometimes in unison, sometimes broken into sharp bursts, like fragments of a conversation that made no sense. On still nights, when the cicadas quieted and the wind died, the voices carried farther. A farmer swore he heard two voices singing together, though the song had no melody, only a droning repetition that left him chilled long after he had hurried past. Animals, too, seemed disturbed by the farmhouse. Horses refused to draw wagons past the Sullivan gate without protest, stamping and pulling as though resisting an unseen hand. Dogs, usually indifferent to such things, barked wildly at the fence line and could not be coaxed closer. Some neighbors began to say outright that the land itself had soured, that whatever was hidden within the Sullivan home had begun to seep outward, tainting the very ground. Whispers grew bold enough to surface in church pews, where families leaned close to trade suspicions during sermons. Some clung to the belief that the twins were simply malformed, their appearance so grotesque that Thomas and Eleanor sought to protect them from ridicule. Others believed the children were not merely strange, but touched by something darker, that their condition was not of the body, but of the soul. A few even muttered that the Sullivans had struck a bargain with forces unholy, and that the children were proof of it. Through all of this, Thomas remained rigid, Eleanor silent. The shutters stayed closed, the lights burned late, and the sounds continued to spill into the night. Each new sighting, each new voice in the dark, became another piece of evidence in a growing narrative. Whatever lived inside that house, the community believed, was not meant to be seen by human eyes. In a region where formal physicians were scarce, traveling doctors were both a lifeline and a curiosity. They arrived with small wagons, carrying boxes of tinctures, powders and tools, offering cures for ailments that local remedies could not touch. Many were charlatans, selling opium as cough syrup or bottles of colored water as miracle tonics. But a few were genuine men of medicine, educated in cities, moving restlessly from one rural town to the next in search of patients, payment, and sometimes simply purpose. It was such a doctor who is said to have stumbled upon the Sullivan's secret. The man's name, if it was ever known, has been lost to time, but fragments of his notes survived in a county archive decades later. He recorded visiting the Sullivan farm under the pretense of offering remedies for fever. Thomas allowed him in, though reluctantly, and Eleanor kept to the shadows. The doctor noted the house was dim, the shutters nailed in place, the air thick with the smell of oil and stale wood. He also observed something else, an odd hush, punctuated by faint sounds drifting from above. He wrote that at first he believed it to be children sick with whooping cough, but the noises were not consistent with illness. They were rhythmic, deliberate, more like speech than coughing. When the doctor inquired directly, Thomas became agitated, insisting there were no children in the house, that his family had suffered loss and wished to grieve in peace. Yet later that evening, when the physician lingered longer than was welcome, he claimed to have glimpsed movement at the top of the stairs. Two small figures, standing close together in the shadows, their outlines indistinct. He described the sensation that they were watching him, though he could not clearly see their faces. The image haunted him, so much so that he later wrote he felt the gaze of two, though they moved as one. Whatever he saw that night was enough to disturb him profoundly. In his scattered notes, he made mention of anomalies, physical, behavioral, or both, but stopped short of detail. Either he feared ridicule, or he feared the consequences of putting such things to paper. He left the Sullivan home at dawn and did not return, but his visit was enough to spark whispers anew. For the doctor had spoken to one man in town, quietly, almost in confidence, and from that seed another round of rumors began to grow. The fragments that remain of the Sullivan twins' existence offer only glimpses, but those glimpses are enough to unsettle. The physician who visited their home never committed to a full description, but in one of his surviving notes he wrote of forms that defied the eye. Some later claimed this was a careful way of suggesting deformity, a polite refusal to put uglier details into words. Yet others argued that his hesitation spoke of something more profound, that what he had seen did not fit neatly into the categories of medicine at all. Neighbors who insisted they had overheard the children described voices that seemed unnatural. When one child spoke, the other echoed, not as mimicry, but in perfect time, the two voices rising and falling together as though rehearsed. A farmer's wife claimed she once lingered outside the Sullivan fence at dusk and heard the twins laughing, but the sound chilled her because there was no difference between the two tones. They were identical, overlapping, the same sound duplicated. She swore it reminded her not of children, but of a single voice doubled back upon itself. Other accounts described their movements. A boy who had climbed an oak near the Sullivan property told of seeing two figures briefly at the upstairs window. He said they moved in unison, stepping forward and back together, as if one shadow controlled them both. When he described what he saw to his parents, he was punished for lying. Yet the memory stayed with him into adulthood, and he repeated it when the story of the Sullivans resurfaced years later. There were physical details too, though they are the most unreliable. Some claimed the twins were conjoined at the torso, joined so closely that separation would have been impossible. Others believed they shared a single body with two heads, or that one twin was twisted upon the other like a mirror reversed. A few went so far as to whisper that their eyes never looked apart, always fixed together in one direction, as though their sight was fused. None of these descriptions can be proven, but all point to the same conclusion. Whatever the twins looked like, they were disturbing enough that their family chose secrecy over acceptance. The medical journals of the time, even those lost in obscurity, bear no official record of the Sullivan twins. It is as if the children were deliberately omitted, erased before their story could ever be examined. And in the vacuum of fact, rumor took root, growing into legend, until the twins became less children than specters haunting the history of a single family. When talk turned to the twins' appearance, even the most rational voices stumbled into the language of the uncanny. Conjoined children were not unknown in the 19th century, but they were rare enough to be seen as divine wonders or abominations, depending on who judged them. The most famous pair, Chang and Eng Bunker, had toured America as living curiosities only decades earlier, yet even they were met with both fascination and revulsion. To imagine such a phenomenon arriving in a quiet Alabama farmhouse, far from the curiosities of the cities, was enough to stir the imagination of an entire county. But the descriptions of the Sullivan twins never matched neatly with known cases. Conjoined at the chest, at the hip, or joined so completely that they shared organs, limbs, or even a mind. The whispers grew more distorted with each telling. One account claimed they moved as one body, though each possessed a separate face. Another swore the children never seemed to age, that years passed, but their forms remained unchanged, as if locked in infancy. A few went further still, muttering that the children possessed abilities beyond flesh, that they spoke words in languages no one had taught them, or that they foresaw events in the community before they occurred. These claims were likely exaggerations, born of fear, but once attached to the story, they clung stubbornly. The more extraordinary the rumor, the more it spread. Farmers who had never seen the twins swore they knew what they looked like. Women who had never stepped inside the farmhouse described the children's cries as though they had heard them firsthand. It became impossible to separate memory from invention, fact from embellishment. Yet this very confusion lent the story its power. For if no one could say for certain what the twins were, then they could be anything, monsters, miracles, or something in between. Science might have offered clarity, but in the Alabama countryside of 1853, science was fragile, muffled beneath superstition and fear. A physician who studied the twins risked not only his credibility but his standing with the church and community. Easier, then, to let the matter remain unsaid. And so, where there should have been diagnosis, there was silence. Where there should have been record, there was erasure. And in that erasure, the legend of the Sullivan twins only deepened until they ceased to be children at all and became something far stranger, living symbols of what could not or would not be explained. If Thomas Sullivan was the shield that kept curious neighbours at bay, then Eleanor was the silent keeper of the secret itself. Those who remembered her before the twins' birth described her as gentle, quick to smile, and soft-spoken but present. Afterward, she seemed to vanish into shadow. When she did appear, her eyes were lowered, her face pale, her body thin, as though sleepless nights had hollowed her out. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were clipped and cautious, as though she were afraid of betraying something with the wrong phrase. It was Eleanor, more than Thomas, who seemed to carry the burden of concealment upon her shoulders. Stories circulated of her daily rituals, gleaned from neighbours who claimed to have spied upon the Sullivan property. She was seen carrying trays of food up the narrow stairs at odd hours, always alone, never accompanied by her husband. Sometimes she would linger at the window in the upstairs room, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek into the yard, her face pale in the glow of lamplight, before quickly retreating. On other occasions, neighbours swore they heard her singing softly, almost like a lullaby, though the words were indistinct. These fragments, combined with the absence of any public acknowledgement of her children, fueled the image of a mother locked in a private vigil over her hidden offspring. Her silence outside the home was equally telling. When approached by women of the parish who tried to extend kindness, Eleanor offered no explanations, only brief nods and tight smiles. One neighbour recalled asking her directly if she had been blessed with children. Eleanor, after a long pause, had simply murmured, "They are with me," before turning away. The phrase lingered, heavy with implication. It was not a denial, but neither was it a confession. As months turned into years, Eleanor's reclusion deepened. While Thomas continued to appear in town, stiff and defensive, Eleanor faded entirely from community life. At church, she sat wordless, her hands clenched white around her prayer book, her gaze fixed on the altar but unfocused. People whispered that she was wasting away, consumed by a secret too terrible to bear. Others speculated she had gone mad, driven to obsession by the task of hiding what should never have been hidden. Whatever her state of mind, one truth was clear. Eleanor's life became defined by the concealment of her children. If Thomas enforced the walls around the twins, Eleanor was the one who lived within those walls, tethered to them by bonds of fear, guilt, and perhaps a love twisted into something desperate. She became, in the eyes of her neighbours, less a woman than a ghost haunting her own house. If Eleanor carried the daily burden of secrecy within the house, Thomas bore the weight of it in the eyes of the world. A man of rigid posture and stern belief, Thomas Sullivan had long been regarded as a figure of moral steadiness in his community. He quoted scripture freely, seldom missed a Sunday service, and was known to discipline his household with an iron will. But after the twins' birth, those who knew him began to notice a change in his manner. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. The man who once greeted neighbours with firm handshakes now passed them with curt nods. His voice, once steady and confident, grew strained, as though each word was a stone carried in his mouth. In the 19th century South, faith was both shield and weapon. For a man like Thomas, it should have been the answer to any trial. And yet, the existence of children who defied explanation gnawed at his beliefs. If they were a blessing, why did they bring such shame? If they were a curse, what sin had called it down upon his house? Some believed Thomas turned more deeply toward the church, seeking absolution in ritual and scripture. Others whispered he grew harsher, almost defiant, as though daring God himself to justify what had been placed upon him. His sermons, when he read aloud in men's study groups, became tinged with fire. He dwelled on passages of punishment and wrath, on stories of the unclean cast out from among the faithful. At times he spoke of Job, the man tested beyond endurance, but even then his words seemed less about patience than about defiance. It was as if he sought to convince himself as much as anyone listening that he remained in control. The secrecy, however, frayed at him. Neighbors remembered his temper flaring in ways it never had before. Sudden outbursts when questioned about his family, clenched fists when gossip reached his ears. One storekeeper recalled him slamming coins onto the counter so hard they scattered across the floor when asked gently after his wife's health. To some, this anger was evidence of guilt. To others, it was simply the collapse of a man trapped between duty, shame, and faith. In the end, Thomas became a figure both feared and pitied. His silence was no longer the silence of dignity, but of a man cornered by circumstances too great to name. Where faith should have offered comfort, it left him with questions. And where shame should have been eased by confession, it only deepened in the shadows of his locked house. By the 3rd year after the twins' birth, the Sullivan household was no longer simply regarded with curiosity. It had become the subject of near-constant speculation. In towns where little happened beyond the cycles of planting and harvest, rumors spread like wildfire, finding fertile ground in every porch conversation and every whispered exchange after church. The secrecy of the Sullivans gave the community nothing to hold on to, and so the gaps were filled with invention. Every glance, every sound, every absence was stretched into proof that something unholy resided behind those shutters. Women at the well passed the story back and forth in fragments. One would claim she heard cries at night. Another swore she had seen Eleanor carrying bundles too large to be food trays. Children repeated half-remembered tales overheard from their parents, exaggerating details until the twins became monsters in their imagination. A boy might whisper that they had claws, while a girl might insist they had been born with faces on both sides of their heads. By the time such stories circled back to the adults, the exaggerations had taken root, becoming indistinguishable from memory. The gossip took on a moral shape as well. Some claimed the twins were punishment for hidden sins, perhaps Thomas's pride or Eleanor's silence. Others tied the family's misfortune to old whispers of dealings with questionable folk, a long-forgotten debt that had come due. In a community bound by faith, these explanations carried weight. People did not need proof when Scripture already gave them narratives of curses and divine wrath. And yet, beneath the superstition, there was also a quieter form of suspicion. The fear that the Sullivans were harboring something dangerous, not only to themselves but to everyone nearby. Illness was often misunderstood, and strange conditions were sometimes mistaken for contagion. If the twins bore deformities, some worried it might be a disease that could spread. Others fretted that their strange cries and behaviors hinted at madness, which might spill outward into violence. The farmhouse became a place not just of mystery, but of potential threat. Still, no one dared confront the Sullivans directly. The family's silence was both a wall and a weapon. Thomas's temper, Eleanor's ghost-like presence, and the strange atmosphere surrounding the home made intrusion unthinkable. So the community did what communities do best when faced with the unknown. They whispered, they guessed, and they built stories layer upon layer until the legend of the Sullivan twins was larger than the family itself. Among the scattered pieces of the Sullivan story, one of the most tantalizing is the suggestion that a physician did attempt to formally document the twins. His name has been lost, though some accounts link him to Montgomery, a city where medical societies were beginning to gather notes and journals into early records. What is known, or at least remembered, is that he visited the Sullivan farmhouse under circumstances that were never entirely clear. Some say he was called by Thomas himself, desperate for answers. Others insist the doctor came uninvited, having heard the rumors and determined to see for himself. Whatever the truth, his encounter with the family was said to have produced a set of notes, brief, clinical, and deeply unsettling. The fragments that later surfaced describe a doubling of form that resists separation, and speech given in chorus with no hesitation between one and the other. He noted their eyes, which seemed to follow as one, as though bound by an unseen cord. These remarks, though spare, give more than any other source we have. Yet even in his own words, the physician was cautious. He admitted uncertainty, confessing that he could not classify the condition with any confidence, for it seems to extend beyond deformity and into behavior most unnatural. If these words were ever published, they have been lost to history. Local doctors of the era would later deny knowledge of the case, claiming no such children were ever presented to them. But the very existence of the notes, however fragmented, suggests otherwise. They imply that, at least once, the Sullivan twins were seen not only by neighbors through shutters, but by trained eyes, recorded in terms meant for science rather than gossip. The most haunting line in the surviving fragments is the simplest: "They watched me." The doctor's handwriting, jagged and hurried in that passage, betrays the unease he felt. Perhaps it was only the stare of two frightened children. Perhaps it was something stranger, the uncanny effect of voices and movements too perfectly matched. Whatever he saw, it was enough to push him toward documentation, even as it rattled his composure. But the record did not last. The notes disappeared almost as quickly as they surfaced. Some believed they were deliberately destroyed, others that the doctor himself suppressed them out of fear. What remains is only a whisper of a record, a reminder that the Sullivan twins almost entered history in ink before being swallowed back into shadow. The mystery of the physician's notes is almost as chilling as the twins themselves. If the fragments that survive are to be trusted, they were once part of a larger account, a series of pages that attempted to describe the Sullivan children in clinical detail. Yet by the time the notes were mentioned publicly, decades after the events, nearly all of them had vanished. What remained were only scattered references in county archives, copied into ledgers by clerks who had no context, no explanation, and perhaps no desire to keep more than a passing record. So what happened to the original account? One theory suggests that Thomas Sullivan himself demanded their destruction. If the physician had dared to put his observations into writing, Thomas, proud and fearful, may have seen it as a direct threat to his family's reputation. A man determined to shield his household from the gaze of neighbors would not hesitate to suppress anything that might expose their secret to a wider world. It would not have been difficult for him to pressure or even pay a doctor into silence. Others argued the disappearance was less direct. Physicians in the 19th century were keenly aware of how fragile their reputations were. To publish something so unusual, so sensational, risked mockery or dismissal. If the twins could not be neatly categorized within accepted medical knowledge, then to present them might have been professional suicide. Better to burn the pages than to endure ridicule from peers in Montgomery, New Orleans, or farther afield. And so the notes may have been abandoned, left to fade, remembered only by rumor until scraps surfaced later in official records. There is, too, the darker possibility that the notes were suppressed not by Thomas, not by the doctor himself, but by others with authority. Churches often wielded power over what was considered acceptable to discuss. A physician's account describing children who spoke in unison, who seemed bound by more than flesh, could have been interpreted as blasphemous, an affront to doctrine. If word of such a document reached the wrong ears, its destruction might have been ordered outright, buried in the name of preserving the community's moral order. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Where there might have been a clear description of the Sullivan twins, their appearance, their behaviors, their condition, there was instead only absence. The children slipped through the cracks, acts of record existing only in whispers and fragments, and the very act of erasing them seemed to confirm what the community already feared, that the truth was too terrible to be seen in the light. When the physician's words were reduced to scraps and silence, suspicion turned toward the church. In mid-19th century Alabama, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the backbone of authority, the judge of morality, and the arbiter of what could be spoken aloud. If the Sullivan's secret was ever known beyond the walls of their farmhouse, then it is almost certain it reached the ears of the clergy, and if it did, the response would not have been gentle. Whispers suggested that the twins were not seen as children at all, but as evidence of sin. Parishioners muttered about verses in Leviticus, warnings about the unclean and the cursed. Some even claimed that Thomas himself had confided in the pastor, desperate to frame the children's existence as a divine test rather than a condemnation. But if he sought compassion, what he received was judgment. At least one account tells of sermons delivered in the years following the twins' birth, sermons heavy with fire and wrath, condemning those who would harbour wickedness under their own roof. Though the name Sullivan was never spoken, the implication was clear to all who sat in the pews. The congregation, too, played its part. Rural churches thrived on conformity, and any family that strayed from the pattern became a cautionary tale. For Eleanor, the shame of being a mother marked in such whispers must have been unbearable. For Thomas, whose pride was already frayed, the weight of suspicion pressed harder each time the pastor's gaze lingered too long. The more the church spoke of sin, the more the Sullivans sealed their shutters, isolating themselves not only from their neighbours, but from the very community that once defined them. There were even rumours of something more direct, that church elders visited the Sullivan farm under cover of night, perhaps to see the children for themselves. No one could say what they found, but the speculation was endless. Some claimed the elders advised the family to keep the twins hidden for life, to treat their existence as a private penance. Others went further, whispering that prayers of exorcism had been muttered within the farmhouse walls, as though the children's condition was not of flesh, but of spirit. Whether true or not, these whispers only deepened the legend. If the church, the great authority of the time, had moved to erase or conceal the twins, then the story was no longer just about a family's shame. It was about a curse the community believed should never have been brought to light. The story might have remained only rumour, if not for the tale of the locked room. No one agrees on exactly when it happened, but nearly every version places it sometime in the mid-1850s, when suspicion around the Sullivan farmhouse had reached its peak. According to one account, a hired hand sent to assist with harvest claimed he was ordered never to step inside the house. Yet temptation gnawed at him, and while Thomas laboured in the fields, the man slipped through the back door. What he described later was enough to keep Heto silent for years. A staircase leading to a door bolted from the outside, its wood scarred with scratches that looked too high to have been made by animals. Behind it, he swore, came the faint sound of children, voices low, rising and falling together like a prayer. Other versions tell of neighbours who entered not out of curiosity, but of necessity. One story speaks of a storm that damaged the farmhouse roof, drawing several men from the parish to help secure it. While searching for boards, one of them claimed to have stumbled upon the upstairs chamber. The door was locked tight, and Thomas, upon noticing their interest, flew into a rage, driving them out of the house before they could ask questions. Later, one man swore that in the brief moment before Thomas appeared, he saw a thin hand curl around the edge of the curtain in the room beyond. The most unsettling account came decades later, passed down by a woman who said her grandfather had once forced his way into the Sullivan home during a dispute over land. She claimed he had described a small room, window shutters nailed closed, a bed against the wall, and the air so thick with the smell of oil lamps it made him choke. And in the centre of the room, he saw two figures standing together in the dim light. He would not describe them further, only that they turned their heads toward him at the same moment, as if drawn by one cord. He fled, she said, and refused to speak of it again. Whether these stories were truth or invention, they became inseparable from the legend. The image of the locked room, its scratches, its bolted door, its hidden occupants, entered the folklore of the county. From that point on, the Sullivan house was not simply secretive. It was a prison, a place where children lived in darkness, shut away from the world by the very people meant to protect them. The locked room was not only remembered for what it concealed, but for what was sometimes heard escaping from it. Those who claimed to have lingered too close to the Sullivan farmhouse after dark spoke of voices that seemed almost rehearsed, words spoken in perfect time. Two children, they said, but not speaking as siblings might, one echoing the other. Instead, the twins' voices rose and fell together, syllable for syllable, as though one mind directed both tongues. The effect, according to a farmer who once passed on the road at dusk, was unnatural in its harmony, a chorus that felt less like play and more like chant. Even more disturbing were reports that when the twins spoke separately, the difference was negligible. A neighbour's daughter swore she once heard them through the shutters during a summer evening, each asking questions of the other, yet their tones were indistinguishable. "It was like one voice thrown across two mouths," she later said. Such details were impossible to prove, yet they circulated with the persistence of truth, embedding themselves into every retelling of the story. Other accounts insisted the twins not only spoke together, but laughed, cried, and even sang in the same rhythm. A man delivering grain to the Sullivans claimed he paused by the barn and heard a melody inside the house, faint but clear. Two voices, young and high, carrying a tune that had no structure, no words, just a rising and falling sound repeated again and again. He described it as a kind of drone, like the buzzing of bees, but made of children's throats. He refused to go inside afterward, saying he could not shake the impression that the voices were aware of his listening. Such behavior, whether exaggerated or not, fed the conviction that the Sullivan twins were not merely malformed, but unnatural. In a time when even ordinary twins could be regarded with superstition, this perfect unison seemed to confirm the worst fears of the community. To some, it suggested possession or a single soul stretched unnaturally across two bodies. To others, it was evidence that the children were no longer entirely human at all, but something other, something created by forces no one dared to name aloud. The voices that slipped into the night, carried on the humid Alabama air, transformed the Sullivans' secret into something larger than themselves. No longer hidden children, the twins became legends of the unnatural, spoken not as neighbors, but as omens. If the twins' voices unsettled the community, the scattered accounts of their appearance left an even deeper scar. No single description agreed with another, yet all carried the same undertone of dread. A farm boy who claimed to have glimpsed them through the nailed shutters said they were joined at the shoulder, their small frames leaning into one another as if balance itself required their union. Years later, a woman who passed down her story to grandchildren insisted they were joined not at the shoulder but at the chest, a single torso branching into two heads that turned together with eerie precision. Others whispered of a body twisted upon itself, limbs doubled or fused, so that it was unclear where one child ended and the other began. Most chilling of all were the stories that described their eyes. A travelling merchant, eager for coin and attention, told of a visit to the farmhouse in which he claimed to have seen them by accident when a curtain shifted. He said their eyes moved in perfect synchrony, not independently as most twins might, but as though guided by one cord. If one looked left, so did the other. If one looked upward, so did its sibling, never breaking their unity. He confessed that the sight had driven him away in haste, and though his story may have been embellished to entertain an audience, its detail rang uncomfortably close to what others had hinted at in quieter tones. For neighbors already steeped in suspicion, such descriptions were proof of their worst fears. To them, the twins were no longer pitiable children, but creatures, something malformed beyond natural understanding. In a world where science had little vocabulary for congenital anomaly, deformity became equated with curse, and when fear hardened into certainty, the community began to speak of the Sullivans not with pity, but with revulsion. There were darker rumors still, passed only in hushed voices. Some claimed the twins bore marks on their skin, patches of discoloration shaped like symbols or bruises that never faded. Others swore their mouths moved without sound, forming words unseen by listeners. The truth of these claims is impossible to verify, but their persistence shaped how the story was remembered. The Sullivan twins ceased to be thought of as children at all. They became warnings, spectres of flesh and bone, symbols of sin and secrecy preserved in rumor long after their brief lives flickered out. As the stories of the twins spread and the fear around the Sullivan household deepened, it was perhaps inevitable that the church would intervene more directly. In a time when faith was the first and last authority, strange births and unexplainable behaviors were not treated as medical curiosities but as spiritual battles. To many in the parish, the twins were not children to be studied or pitied, but proof of sin, or worse, of possession. And if possession was suspected, then the response would not be silence. It would be confrontation. The details of what happened vary with every telling. One account, whispered long after the fact, describes a group of church elders arriving at the Sullivan farm under cover of darkness. They claimed to have heard the strange voices themselves and could no longer allow such blasphemy to remain unchecked. They entered the farmhouse, armed not with medicine, but with scripture, candles, and holy water. Eleanor, it was said, begged them to leave, her voice breaking as she tried to shield her children from their eyes. Thomas, torn between pride and desperation, finally relented and allowed them to see. What followed, if the story is to be believed, was not a healing, but an exorcism. The elders prayed over the twins, chanting passages of deliverance, while the children's voices rose in the same rhythm, mocking or mirroring the prayers in unison. Some claimed the twins grew agitated, their movements violent, while others swore they only stood silently, their gaze fixed, as if upon something unseen. Whatever the truth, the encounter left the elders shaken. By dawn, they departed, saying little, their silence louder than confession. In other versions, the church's intervention was subtler. The pastor himself, it was said, visited the family privately and urged them to treat the twins as a test of faith, to keep them hidden and endure the shame as penance. In this telling, there was no ritual, no confrontation, only quiet orders to erase the children from public life, to bury their existence beneath obedience. Which story is true, or whether either is true at all, may never be known. But what mattered to the community was not accuracy, but belief. The involvement of the church, in rumor or in fact, gave the Sullivan story a new dimension. It was no longer only about a family's secret. It became a tale of sin and sanctity, of a battle between what should be confessed and what must be hidden forever. What is most unsettling about the Sullivan twins is not only the whispers of neighbors or the sermons of fire-breathing pastors, but the silence of the men of science. For if even one physician truly examined the children, why does no record survive? Why do the journals of local medical societies, the ledgers of county hospitals, and the archives of southern universities contain not a single definitive entry? The absence of documentation is not natural omission, it is erasure. Stories persist that at least 2 doctors saw the twins. One was the traveling physician who left behind his scattered fragments. The other, a young doctor from Montgomery, whose name is now lost, but who, according to oral accounts, was called to the farmhouse for consultation. The younger doctor reportedly described the twins' condition in letters to a colleague in Mobile, but those letters never surfaced. Some say they were destroyed by the family. Others claim they were suppressed by the doctor's own peers, who warned him against publishing something that would brand him a fraud or a sensationalist. In an era where credibility was everything, a case too strange to fit known categories could ruin a man overnight. There are hints, too, that the church's hand extended into these silences. Physicians who relied on community trust could not afford to cross the clergy. If a pastor declared the twins to be a curse or a test, then no doctor in his right mind would dare contradict him in writing. To put their existence into medical language might have been seen as stripping away the moral lesson the church wished to impose. Easier, then, for physicians to keep their pens still, their observations confined to memory or private conversation. But the absence of medical records had another effect. It allowed rumor to swell unchecked. Had the twins been described in scientific terms, they might have been remembered as a rare but natural case. Instead, the void left by silence was filled with imagination, transforming them from children with abnormalities into figures of supernatural dread. In this way, the doctors themselves became participants in the concealment. By refusing to speak, they ensured the story would never be explained, only whispered, distorted, and darkened through the decades. The vanishing of the Sullivan twins from the medical record is perhaps the most haunting fact of all. It is not proof that they never existed. It is proof that someone, or many someones, decided that their existence was better forgotten. And in that decision, the children were hidden not only from their neighbors, but from history itself. By the late 1850s, the whispers of the Sullivan twins began to fade, not because the questions were answered, but because the children themselves seemed to disappear. Those who passed the farmhouse no longer heard the murmuring voices, no longer saw faint movements in the upstairs windows. The glow of lamps still burned late into the night, but the sounds that had once unnerved neighbors fell silent. Some believed the twins had died quietly, their lives extinguished in the same secrecy that had defined their existence. Others whispered of something more deliberate, that the children had been buried in haste, hidden in unmarked graves on the Sullivan property. Rumours arose of midnight activity near the back fields, of Thomas digging by lantern light while Eleanor knelt in the grass, her figure trembling in prayer. No grave markers were ever found, but years later, farmers who ploughed the land swore their horses shied from certain patches of earth, refusing to step forward. It was said that in those spots the ground seemed softer, the soil darker, as though disturbed and left unsettled. Another version, darker still, suggested the twins were not buried at all but taken away. One story told of a wagon that came to the farmhouse under cover of a storm, its driver unknown. Neighbours claimed they heard the creak of wheels and the cry of children muffled beneath the thunder. By morning the wagon was gone, and the house was quieter than ever. If this account is to be believed, the twins may have been removed not for burial, but for study, spirited away by physicians determined to examine them in secret. The most unsettling theory was passed down in whispers too fragile to withstand daylight, that the twins never died, never left, but remained locked in their chamber until time erased them. Some claimed the scratches on the upstairs door remained visible long after the Sullivans themselves had gone, proof of hands that had clawed for freedom. A few even swore that in later years, when the farmhouse stood empty, strange sounds could still be heard from its upper rooms, faint, childlike, impossibly in unison. No record exists of their final days, no burial, no death certificate, no baptismal entry. In the end, the Sullivan twins vanished as mysteriously as they lived, erased from paper, buried in rumour, their fates sealed not by truth but by silence. After the whispers of the twins began to fade, the Sullivans themselves seemed to unravel. The family that had once held a place of quiet respect within the community became more like shadows at the edge of memory, present but dim, their name invoked more as a caution than as kin. Thomas Sullivan, once proud and upright in the church pews, grew gaunt and restless. His temper, already known to flare in the years of secrecy, deepened into bitterness. He was said to walk the property at night with a lantern, circling the fields as though guarding against unseen threats. By day, he worked the land with obsessive focus, but neighbours noted his crops seemed neglected, weeds rising where once there had been order. Eleanor, meanwhile, withered into near invisibility. She stopped attending church altogether, leaving Thomas to appear alone. Some claimed they glimpsed her only at the upper windows of the farmhouse, her figure pale behind the curtains, watching the road but never stepping onto it. Her silence became legend in itself, a haunting presence that outlasted the whispers of her children. Even those who pitied her could not deny the air of strangeness that clung to her, as if she carried not only grief but something deeper, a secret pressed so heavily upon her spirit that it left no room for life. The family's isolation grew worse after the supposed death or disappearance of the twins. With no children presented, no heirs acknowledged, the Sullivans' line began to dwindle. Relatives who might have visited stayed away, uneasy about the reputation the name had gathered. Thomas became more suspicious, quick to drive away any who approached the property, even men offering labour or trade. Over time, the family's ties to the community frayed completely. By the early 1860s, as war began to sweep across the South, the Sullivans were already ghosts in their own county. Records placed Thomas briefly in the local militia, though his service was short, cut off by illness or desertion. Eleanor's name does not appear again in parish registers. The farmhouse itself, once a landmark of unease, began to sink into decay, its shutters sagging, its fields barren. When neighbours spoke of the Sullivans in later years, it was with a mixture of pity and dread. They were not remembered for their harvests, their labour, or even their piety. They were remembered only for what they tried so desperately to hide. Their decline was not sudden, but slow, like a candle burning down to smoke. And when at last the family faded entirely, the mystery of the twins remained the only part of their legacy that endured. When families vanished from the landscape in the 19th century, Their traces often survived only in the margins of Bibles and ledgers. The Sullivans were no different, though no official record of the twins was ever kept in county archives. Stories claim their existence lingered in the faintest of ways. Penciled notes in family registers, cryptic entries written between births and deaths, and gaps in lineage that hinted at children unacknowledged. In one account, a descendant of a neighbouring family swore he once saw the Sullivan Bible at an estate auction decades later. Among its pages, Marcins. Next to Thomas and Eleanor's names was a line scratched out so heavily it tore the thin paper beneath. No names, no dates. Only the ghost of something that had been deliberately erased. Other fragments were less violent, but no less haunting. A ledger from a general store listed purchases made by Thomas in 1853. Extra blankets, an unusual quantity of lamp oil, and more bread flour than a family of 2 should have required. A marginal note beside the entry, written by the storekeeper himself, read only, "Strange." These small, seemingly mundane details fed the conviction that the twins had indeed existed, hidden in plain sight, leaving marks in the daily economy, even as their presence was denied in public. Family stories, too, carried the weight of rumour across generations. Children of the community who had once whispered about the twins grew into adults who passed the tale to their own children, who in turn handed it down again. Each retelling preserved the core of the story while adding embellishments. Some swore the family Bible contained not only scratched-out lines, but verses underlined in heavy ink, passages about curses, about sins visited upon generations. Others insisted that Eleanor herself had written prayers in the margins, desperate pleas for forgiveness penned in a hand unsteady with grief. None of these claims can be proven, but all point to the same reality, that the Sullivan twins, though absent from official records, lived on in the shadows of memory. Their story persisted not because it was written in courthouse ledgers, but because it was whispered over kitchen tables, preserved in half-remembered notes, and carried by the unease of neighbours who could not forget. The twins became less historical figures than generational folklore, their erasure itself serving as proof that something had once been there, too terrible or too strange to remain in ink. As the years passed, and the farmhouse slipped further into disrepair, the story of the Sullivan twins began to shed the skin of rumour and take on the permanence of folklore. Children growers, owing up in the county, were warned never to wander too close to the old Sullivan place, told that the spirits of the twins still lingered in the upstairs room. Parents used the tale as caution, a way to keep children from straying too far after dark. "Stay out of the woods," they would say, "or the Sullivan twins will find you." In this way, the family's tragedy was reshaped into a legend, one that carried fear long after the Sullivans themselves were gone. Folklore thrives on exaggeration, and each generation added its own details. Some told of glowing eyes that watched from the farmhouse windows. Others spoke of 2 small shadows moving across the walls of the abandoned home, even when no light burned inside. The sound of laughter in unison, faint but insistent, became a common theme, with hunters and travellers swearing they heard it when passing the ruins at dusk. Whether these were inventions, tricks of the imagination, or echoes of truth hardly mattered. Once embedded in the local storytelling, the twins became part of the landscape itself. By the turn of the century, when many who had known the Sullivans personally were gone, the story had already hardened into legend. The farmhouse was no longer described as a home, but as a haunted place, a mark upon the land. Schoolchildren dared one another to approach it, to knock on the locked door or call out the twins' names. Most returned with stories of strange silence, of air so heavy it pressed on their chests, of a feeling that they were being watched from the shadows. Folklorists who collected stories from rural Alabama in the early 20th century sometimes recorded fragments of the tale, though stripped of names and dates. They wrote of the hidden twins, of the children who spoke as one, of a house where voices linger. These collected accounts show how the Sullivans' tragedy had already left the realm of history and entered myth, reshaped to fit the community's fears and fascinations. In the end, the Sullivan twins became more than a story of one family. They became symbols woven into the fabric of Southern folklore, not remembered as children, but as shadows in the field, voices in the night, reminders of the things communities bury yet cannot erase. Their legacy was not truth, but fear. What makes the story of the Sullivan twins endure is not simply the horror of what may have been hidden inside that farmhouse, but the fact that no resolution was ever reached. Were they truly children born with a rare condition, concealed by parents who feared shame? Were they spirits of superstition, exaggerated and reshaped by a community eager to find curses in the unexplainable? Or were they something stranger still, something that defied both scripture and science? The questions remain unanswered because every possible thread leads only to silence. If the twins were real, then their absence from official records is striking. No baptism, no burial, no medical account that survives in full. The fragments that exist, a doctor's brief notes, ledger entries that hint at more mouths to feed, prove only that something unusual occurred. But what it was has been obscured, either by deliberate erasure or by the natural decay of memory. The very lack of proof has become proof itself, as though the children were scrubbed from history intentionally, their existence deemed too troubling to record. If, on the other hand, the story is a product of superstition, then it reveals as much about the time as it does about the family. In an era where science faltered and faith often reigned, difference was dangerous. A set of twins who spoke alike, moved alike, or simply looked unusual could become the subject of monstrous exaggeration. Neighbors who heard whispers at night might weave them into curses until two hidden children were no longer human at all, but omens of sin. Fear has always been fertile ground for legend, and in the Alabama countryside of 1853, that fear could twist truth into something far darker. And yet, there lingers the possibility that the twins were neither ordinary nor supernatural, but something caught between, an anomaly of flesh and mind that baffled the limited knowledge of the time. Modern medicine might have explained their condition, named it, catalogued it, and left it as a curious case study. But in their own age, such explanations were impossible. Science was too fragile and superstition too strong. And so the twins remained in shadow, suspended between categories, erased from one record and immortalized in another. The whispered record of fear. The mystery persists because it was never resolved. In silence, the story grew larger, and in that silence, the twins became eternal. The story of the Sullivan twins leaves us with no tidy ending, only questions that deepen the further we look. Their lives, if they were truly lived, flickered briefly in the darkened rooms of a farmhouse in Alabama, then vanished into silence. No grave bears their names, no document records their faces. Their existence is carried only in whispers, fragments of ledgers and stories passed from mouth to mouth across generations. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that entire lives, even extraordinary ones, can be erased not by accident, but by design. What else has been hidden? How many families concealed children born different, treating them as curses rather than kin? How many doctors suppressed cases that could not be explained, fearful of ridicule, fearful of the church, fearful of themselves? For every story that lingers in folklore, there may be dozens more that never left the shadows, sealed away in houses whose shutters closed tight against the world. The Sullivan twins are not only a mystery, but a reminder of a silence that once governed entire communities, the silence of shame, of superstition, and of fear. And yet, paradoxically, their very erasure ensured their survival. By refusing to speak plainly, by striking names from Bibles and burning notes, the community gave birth to something larger than fact. The twins became myth, woven into the folklore of the South, remembered not as children, but as symbols. They stand as emblems of everything the past tried to bury, the strange, the unexplainable, the inconvenient truths that threatened the order of their world. Today, we are left only with shadows, echoes, and uneasy possibilities. Were the Sullivan twins children with a rare condition? Were they victims of superstition that branded them monsters? Or did they exist in some realm we still cannot fully understand, their story a crack in the veil between what we know and what we fear? We may never know. And perhaps that is why their legend endures, because the unanswered is always more powerful than the explained. As we close this story, we are left with a question larger than the twins themselves. How many other lives were erased in silence, their stories left to wither, their truths denied the dignity of record? If the Sullivan twins teach us anything, it is that history is not only what is written down, but also what is deliberately forgotten. And sometimes the forgotten is the most terrifying of all. If stories like this haunt you as much as they haunt us, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. It helps us bring more of these forgotten histories back into the light. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight?